Unit 2B6, Media and Interest Group. Please add 3 things to each slide. Go ahead and pause them when I'm done. All right, so I think one of the most important things to remember when you're discussing media is the incentives involved with the 3 major players. First, we have citizens. Citizens' incentives are to hold politicians accountable without trying too hard. Citizens want to have information, but they don't have time to go through and read every single little thing about everything that happens in politics or in the news. So they have the media. The media helps them out in this scenario. It filters through information and gives the citizens what they need. But you have to remember, media's purposes aren't only to give citizens what they need. They also want to increase viewership or readership because, well, media is business. So they're trying to increase their business by increasing viewership and thus ad revenue. In order to do all of this, you have to have politicians or the government in the mix. Politicians or the government want to be re-elected. They want to control. They want to control the government, and they want to shape the messages through the media to the citizens, because ultimately the citizens are going to hold the politicians accountable. So this is a complicated 3-way relationship, but if you keep the interests in mind, that'll help you be a better critical thinker. Go ahead and pause and add 3 things. All right, in order to understand media in the United States, you have to understand its history. So in colonial America, there really was not many media sources. In fact, because of the technology, it was really difficult to even print newspapers. You had to actually have this big press with each little letter that you would move, and then you would dip it in ink and then dip it on the piece of paper. Well, and press it on each particular copy manually. So in 1729, you have Ben Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette. That's sort of the reason that he became well known. There wasn't very many circulations. It was only in major cities, and only the wealthy were able to afford them. Once the United States was founded, immediately after the Constitution was ratified, there was a push to put in the Bill of Rights, or the Bill of Rights were actually ratified, which included the First Amendment. And if you recall, one of the rights in the First Amendment is the freedom of press. But immediately, within 10 years after this action, there is what's called the Alien and Sedition Act. It was passed. Made it a crime to criticize President or the Congress. This eventually expired. It was pretty controversial, but it was a clear violation of the freedom of press. Next step in this history process is the advent of technology. Printing presses became easier and more automated, so you'd only have to place the letters in one time, and the press would over and over again press it upon the copies of paper. It was cheaper and faster, so it allowed the newspapers actually get cheaper. They went from around 6 cents an issue to 1 cent an issue. Now, of course, to us, 6 cents and 1 cent sounds pretty cheap, but imagine suddenly a Subway footlong, which right now is $5 or $6, going down to $1. More people would go to Subway, that's for sure. Also, there is an important advent of the telegraph. Telegraph was 1833, 1834. A guy named Samuel Morse invented the telegraph. What this did is it allowed people to send electronic pulses through wires over long distances. So suddenly people could communicate long distances. Well, the press immediately grabs a hold of this, and they join their money together and they create wire services. Today, and actually then it was the Associated Press. Today, you'll see in the Cedar Rapids Gazette, you'll see in the CNN, ABC, you'll see stories by the Associated Press. These are purchased from that group, and they're not written by the Gazette or ABC. They're written by this Associated Press. This really helped spread national news and really helped spread the speed of news that could be put into newspapers. Go ahead and pause and add 3 things. what occurred after that is an expansion of what's called partisanship in the media. Partisanship is rooting for your political party as if it's a team. Didn't matter what you believed or who was on your team, you'd root for them. Example I generally give is, if you're a Bears fan, you do not like the Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers. But if Aaron Rodgers suddenly became the Chicago Bears, you'd be okay with him. And that's because suddenly he's on your team. Well, that's the way that newspapers reported stories in the late 1800s, is they were extremely partisan. The New York Tribune was strongly anti-slavery. That's a real good example there. They were radical Republicans. In the late 1890s became a wave of media sort of pushing for reform after the Gilded Age or during it. Muckrakers, investigative journalists like Lincoln Steffens or Ida Tarbell wrote a whole series of journal articles and newspaper articles about Standard Oil, which was a giant monopoly of the time run by a guy named John D. Rockefeller. Yellow journalism is a famous example of Hearst's New York Journal began actively trying to start a war in Cuba, and it did eventually lead to the United States entering the Spanish-American War after the sinking of the Maine. A famous quote from him is from a photographer that he sent to Maine. The photographer telegraphed back, "Hey, there's no war here, nothing's really going on." Hearst famously replied, something of this nature, "You provide me the pictures, I'll provide the war," meaning that he was just going to make it up. The New York Times was created in 1896, and this is sort of the first step of really trying to be neutral. All the news that's fit to print, impartiality and accuracy was the goal, which is funny because now New York Times is largely viewed as a liberal paper. Also, there's a whole lot of new technology that occurred in the mid-1900s, specifically 1920. After World War I, the government allowed airwaves to be used by commercial groups, so by companies. Immediately, radio stations pop up, and they have news, and they have music, and that spreads a national culture. A couple decades later, television stations with the increasing technology availability and ability. All of this is regulated by the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission. That's really important. The FCC is part of the executive branch that controls what media companies do. They feel like that is that airwaves are public, like air, and they expected the station owners to serve the public interest. They really controlled a lot of parts about the media. For example, they limited the number of owners in any particular market, so only one company can own so much or so many radio stations or television stations within one area. They also had two important rules. One was called the Fairness Doctrine, meaning that if you were going to provide news, you had to provide a wide variety of points of view. They were trying to eliminate partisanship. This ended in 1987, as we'll see here in a minute. The other thing that still occurs today is something called the equal time provision. This requires broadcast media to provide equal airtime on any non-news programming to all candidates running. So, for example, Stephen Colbert was seriously considering running for president. I'm pretty sure as a joke, but maybe not. He was considering running for president in 2012 and making it an official running for president. He did have an official political action committee, but the problem is that Comedy Central, through the equal time provision, the station that his program is on, would have had to actually provide time for the opposing party to have candidates, to have campaign ads as well. And, well, Comedy Central didn't like that. So that is still in effect today. Go ahead and pause and add three things. The next step, really the big one, is the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This deregulated or eliminated rules, gave the FCC the power to revise all ownership and content restrictions that it had done since it was created. The Fairness Doctrine was eliminated. Ownership restrictions are eliminated. This means that there can be more concentration of one company in an area. One company can control a lot of different media outlets within one area. Also, you can be a cross ownership, meaning you can own the radio and a television station and a cable company. All of this equals giant media conglomerates. For example, today, ESPN, ABC, and Disney are all owned by the same company. So there's only a handful of these companies out there that are giant media conglomerates because they own so much content. And that all occurred because of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Go ahead and pause and add 3 things. So if we look at the different types of media that we have today, the first is daily newspapers. These are local. There's local ones like the Gazette. The New York Times is read nationally, but it is a local paper. So if you read the New York Times, you would have like a New York City section that you would have to read. Then there are just a few actual national newspapers. USA Today is one. The Wall Street Journal is a widely read daily national newspaper as well. You can see those in your supermarkets or anywhere the papers are sold, typically gas stations. Also, there are magazines that report specifically news. There's all sorts of magazines that aren't really that great news, but as far as political news, there is things like Time Magazine, which tries to be sort of impartial as an institution, but the journalists themselves have pretty potent and partisan positions as well. The National Review is a conservative weekly magazine. It often depicts, on the cover in the last 6 years, it's depicted Obama as a caricature quite often and in a not positive light. The Atlantic is actually a really difficult read. It's a really great magazine that I personally like a lot, and its subtitle is "Of No Party or Clique," so it attempts to be neutral or nonpartisan. Of course, as a magazine, not on the individual journalists' opinions, right? Then we also have television. We have major national TV networks. These are the ones that you can get over, the digital antenna. ABC, CBS, Fox, NBC. You don't actually need cable to get any of those. You can get them over the airwaves. Thanks CNN for the 24-hour news cycle, so we can listen constantly to some itty-bitty news piece for 24 hours, or a major piece of news occurs and then they investigate every single part of it. And there is also a handful of partisan news sources on television that basically only promote one side of political arguments, which is like MSNBC is a really liberal station right now, and Fox News Network is a conservative one. On the radio, ABC, CBS, and Clear Channel are the big dogs in the radio world. They own most of the radio companies or stations that we even have locally. Then a lot of times, the talk radio is a lot of times on AM, sometimes on FM, but it's dominated by conservatives. Rush Limbaugh show is an example of that. Also, there's National Public Radio, which is funded by the national and state governments, and it provides a lot of interesting news stories for it, interesting news for the public good. So the media uses polls. Polls are large questionnaires that try to figure out what citizens think. They're actually pretty hard to make without bias. So the first one is like a straw poll. So literally, it's an informal way of polling. It's unreliable, but often used because it's easier. So you just go around and ask people what they think. Not every single person has an equal opportunity to get asked the question, so it doesn't really represent the population as a whole. A scientific poll is the type that uses certain rules to find a sample, which means an accurate smaller group that represents a larger group of people. In order to do this, every single person has to have this equal opportunity in order to be selected for these particular questions. Gallup.com has daily polls you can look on every single political opinion, and they've for sure got some sort of poll that they've used, and even a story that they provide to interpret their polls. The Pew Research Center is also another one. Go ahead and pause and add 3 things. All right, so the ways politicians use media. It used to be private discussions with the party, 1950s and before. Now, politicians use the media significantly. And they use the media to do a whole lot of things. They're trying to shape the message that they're providing to the people of the United States. They'll hold press conferences. For example, the president has press conferences constantly. He also has a press secretary, which is his sort of representative to the journalists on a weekly basis. He'll have photo opportunities, so will other politicians. Most of the photos that you see on the news are those are actually set up, and they are not impromptu. They are carefully selected and crafted to sort of portray some sort of whatever the politician wants. They'll have news releases and news leaks. These are where they're giving information to the media. Now, a lot of times when you'll hear, there'll be a leak about the Obama administration is going to tell us that Obamacare has, 7.1 million people signed up for it. Well, they didn't announce that. There's a leak, and that leak was on purpose. Somebody in the administration talked to a media person and said, hey, tomorrow we're going to, issue this number, and Obama knew about that leak. It's not accidental. They also spin. Every single politician uses this. They try to frame whatever their idea is in a way that collects more people, that gets more people to believe what they believe. Oftentimes, politicians use sound bites, which are statements that fit within, the news. You can get it on a short video clip that can fit in the news, and that's convenient for people to hear. A very famous one is from Ronald Reagan. He says, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." So that's a nice little short soundbite that summarizes his opinion. Also, there's advertisements that politicians use, obviously, for political campaigns. Go ahead and pause and add 3 things. Interest groups. Interest groups are private organizations of citizens looking to influence government and public opinion. These are not people, these are different than political parties because they are trying to influence the government in their policies. They're not trying to get those members aren't trying to get elected. Sometimes there's small interest groups and sometimes there's millions. So if you look at the National Rifle Association is a big interest group. Resources. Sometimes they ask you to donate. Other times, in order to be a member, you must have a membership fee in order to be involved in it. Intensity. Some interest groups are not very intense. The people, they just buy some ads every once in a while and that's it. Other times, other interest groups are extremely intense, where people are participating in their interest group an enormous amount of time by picketing or by issuing ads or by making statements in the newspaper. There's different types of interest groups, and this just measures the components, meaning who is in it. Economic interest groups are interest groups that are made of labor unions, trade associations, which is businesses that make the same thing, professional association. So example is National Association of Manufacturers. So these manufacturing companies get together and try to change government policy for the good of manufacturing companies. Social action and equality groups. The Association for the Advancement of Retired People, National Organization of Women, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People are 3 social action and equality groups that are looking to help sort of the United States as a whole. Public interest groups, social action and equality groups are looking not at the public, not at them as the United States as a whole, but for their group. AARP is for old retired people, now is for women, and National is advanced, and NAACP is for African Americans. Public interest groups are only concerned about sort of helping the United States as a whole. League of Women Voters is actually really prominent in the United States. You might not have heard of them, but they hold a lot of debates, for example, in political campaigns. PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, are a public interest group as well. Go ahead and pause and add 3 things. Okay, the last part is you have to grab a textbook and you're going to read pages 130 to 135 and answer these 4 questions. Which tactic that they use is the most shady, meaning not good or tricky? 2, which tactic do you think sounds the most effective? Which one do you think is going to work the most often? most often. 3, which tactic is the most democratic? And in this way, what I'm asking you is which one sort of fits into the idea of it fits into what our democracy is supposed to do. It fits into how it's supposed to change as opposed to trying to find a wiggle room, a wiggle way around it. Then number 4, match the types of interest groups with the most appropriate strategy for that type. That'll be the last thing.